Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues brings expert guests to the airwaves to talk through your divorce questions and fill in the gray areas about separating. From thinking about divorce to how to behave during divorce to what to do after, this is Divorce Dialogue. Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. I'm the founder of the Miller Law Group and a trainer at the Center for Understanding in Conflict, and I am on a mission to change how people divorce and help them divorce with dignity. And my guest today is Laura Cowan. She's an attorney and a CPA. In fact, she's an award-winning estate planning attorney, and she has extensive experience helping clients navigate life transitions like divorce and maybe more serious transitions as well. And she pivoted from a successful career as a CPA and went to law school at the age of 35 and founded her own law firm focusing on helping individuals and families protect their financial legacy during major life changes. She's been invited multiple times to speak at the United Nations headquarters, where she educates on estate planning issues for employees and immigrants. Laura's upcoming book, The Lifestyle Lawyer Revolution, encourages professionals to define success on their own terms or empowering mindset for anyone rebuilding after a divorce. And I think that the idea of defining success on your own terms after divorce is also a really, really interesting idea. Welcome, Laura Cowan, to Divorce Dialogues.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, it's interesting that in your bio, you talk about how you went to law school after becoming a successful CPA. So, what made you do that? I mean, that's a big thing to do after you're already launched in your career.
Yeah, it was something that I was always interested in doing. Estate planning is a really great practice area, I think, especially for someone with my skill set, because it does really combine what's going on with your family, who are you choosing in these important roles, but you're also determining what happens to all of my money and under what circumstances. And so there's a really interesting intersection of working with families, working with things that are very personal, but also we were dealing with money and assets. And so those are two things that I'm really interested in. So yeah, I went to law school a little bit later in life. I felt like I was about a billion years old when I got there at age
I bet.
35. And now in retrospect, I'm like, it wasn't actually that old, but it certainly felt that way. But yeah, it was a nice combination of the things that I was interested in, and estate planning is just a perfect practice area for that, especially if you're entrepreneurial, which I'm very entrepreneurial. So it kind of checked all the boxes.
Well, that's great. And focusing on estate planning, I think that it's really important to start thinking about that when you're getting divorced, not just after your divorce. So I'm wondering, from your perspective as a CPA and an estate planning attorney, how does estate planning typically change for people when they go through a divorce and become unmarried?
Yeah, so what we always tell people is, there's sort of two steps in the process. The first step is going through the divorce and determining who gets what, and that's all going to be based on the various divorce laws, which many people don't realize are different in every state. Right? So there's going to be that process of who gets what at the end of the divorce. And it's better to not really make any massive changes at that point in time. There might be rules as to what you're allowed to change and what not. But then eventually everything is going to be settled and you're going to have your assets and your spouse is going to have theirs. And then it's important to go ahead and either redo your estate plan if you already have one, because most likely your spouse is going to be nominated in all the major roles. Or if you don't have an estate plan at all, now is the time to do it. But you want to wait until everything has been determined, who gets what, and then you're going to be doing planning for those assets.
For people who don't know what it means to say that your spouse is going to be nominated for all those major roles, maybe you could explain what you mean by that.
Yeah. So when you're doing an estate plan, a big part of it is choosing who you want to act as your fiduciary in various capacities. So this means things like choosing an executor for your will, right? Who's going to be in charge of wrapping everything up when you're gone. Usually when you're married, you nominate your spouse. Well, when you're divorced, then you almost certainly are going to want to pick someone different. It's the same thing for your beneficiaries, who gets your assets when you're gone. That will certainly change after a divorce. Who are you picking to make healthcare decisions for you, financial decisions for you? Again, it would have been your spouse as the number one person in all of these different capacities. And now, that's going to change. So if you don't change the paperwork, then your spouse is still going to be listed, and that might cause some problems.
Yeah, in New York, when people get divorced, it's as if the spouse predeceased. So a lot of people, when they first get married or first have a child, they'll do a very simple will that says everything to my spouse and then to my kids, right? Like that seems like, well, that's what everybody thinks to do. That makes the most sense, and it does. But when that spouse then is no longer your spouse, then what happens for people when they have it's just a simple will like that?
Yeah, they're going to want to update it. It's what's going to happen, because otherwise it's just going to remain in effect. And God forbid something were to happen, that's your legal document that says what happens, right? So it needs to be updated as quickly as possible after the divorce is finalized.
What do you think are some of the most critical estate planning steps that people should do when they're going through or right after their divorce?
So one of the big ones that we see people forgetting about is not updating their beneficiary designations. And not to get too much into the weeds here, but estate planning is about what happens to your checking accounts, your house, your life insurance. All of these different assets have kind of a different way of getting passed at death. So, maybe you go through a divorce and you update your will, and it no longer says everything goes to my ex, now it's going just straight to the kids or whoever, and you do that and you take care of that, and that's great, but you forget that you've named your spouse on your 401k, or that you've named your spouse on your life insurance, or one of those accounts or assets that has like a built-in beneficiary designation. So there's a lot of moving pieces, I would say. And I think that a mistake that I see people make a lot is that they don't realize all the moving pieces. So they might update the will, but not the beneficiary, or vice versa. And their spouse is still sort of entangled in their choices when they don't want that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing, Laura Cowan, that I've seen is a life insurance trust or some kind of inter vivos trust that names the spouse and then defines that person in a way that includes being married, right? And sometimes they don't. And I think that when estate planning lawyers write these life insurance trusts, and I'm going to ask you to talk about what that is in a minute, they're very severe in the way they define it, or it's kind of loosey goosey, and it's really hard to tell whether or not the spouse is named this person, Sally Jones, or is it Sally Jones so long as she's married to me? Or is it, whoever it is married to me at the time that I pass away? And I think that it's really important during the divorce before that person is no longer in that role, because if you want to make a change, you want to make a change while that person can consent, not before they cannot consent. So, what are your thoughts about that?
So when you say life insurance trust, you mean more like an irrevocable life insurance trust that people set up for estate tax purposes?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So, and this is something that confuses a lot of people. There's different kinds of trusts, right? Some are revocable and they can be changed, and others are irrevocable. Sometimes people set up something called an irrevocable life insurance trust if they have enough assets that they have a taxable estate and they're above whatever that threshold is. And so, in order to carve assets out of the estate, maybe they put their life insurance into an irrevocable life insurance trust. And you're right in the sense that this is an irrevocable trust, which means it's a lot harder to make changes. So, yeah, if you've nominated your spouse in some capacity there, then that's something you're definitely going to want to revisit post divorce.
I'm Catherine Miller, and you're listening to Divorce Dialogues, a podcast dedicated to educating people about divorce related topics so everyone can divorce with dignity. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to be sure that you don't miss an episode. And I'm talking today with Laura Cowan about the intersection of divorce and estate planning. And so, Lauren Cowan, in your experience, how can someone protect their financial legacy during a divorce, particularly if it's contentious?
Yeah, I think the idea here is, there's certain things that you're allowed to do throughout the process. And I'm actually more, of an estate planning attorney, less divorce. So I know that there's certain rules that you have to follow. You can't spend certain assets and whatnot.
Sure.
So, so there's following those rules. And then again, I think once the divorce is final and it's really clear who has what, then you can start to decide who I'm going to leave that to now that my spouse is no longer in the picture.
Now I want to change the topic to step families, which is a topic close to my own heart because I have a blended family and have for 26 years. And so it's a complicated thing. So when people remarry and form blended families, what do you think are the estate planning considerations that are essential in those scenarios? Because it's super complicated emotionally and financially.
Yeah, yeah. Blended families are always a little bit tricky just because you don't have that standard everything to the spouse and then down to the kids, and that's just the end of it. Although that scenario can in and of itself present plenty of difficulties. But yeah, children from previous relationships, etc., this can cause a lot of hurt feelings. So, I think it's really clear in these instances, it's very important to be very clear about, who is getting what and to understand that remarriage changes things depending on your state law. You can't disinherit a spouse, right? So in New York you can't legally disinherit your spouse. So some people may not realize, oh, if I'm planning on getting remarried and just still leaving everything to the kids, well, in New York you can't disinherit a spouse, so you may not have wanted a certain percentage of your estate to go to your new partner, your new spouse, but that may be what happens based on the law. So I think it's important to know, what does the law say and what's going to happen by default if you don't get any of these wishes in writing. And then, what the documents in writing can help, what problems they can help solve. That's a
Yeah,
long way of saying yes. Blended families can be very tricky.
yeah, I think so. And I also think that in my experience, sometimes in the divorce negotiation itself, the spouses, the soon to be ex-spouses, want to agree or want the other person to agree more likely to leave their entire estate to the children of this marriage. And that's something that I always discourage because of this possibility of future relationships and future marriage, whatever. But even the relationship in terms of the estate planner's desire to protect the people that he or she loves after they're gone. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but I don't love the overlap between the two areas of law because I always say to people, listen, every marriage ends and the law as to how what applies at the end of the marriage regarding divorce and the end of the marriage regarding death are totally different. Totally different. So for somebody listening who's going through a divorce and thinking, well, I want to protect my children, what do you advise them to do in terms of the actual settlement agreement, assuming they're going to sign one?
The settlement agreement in terms of the divorce.
Yeah, so
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say, again, not being overly familiar with settlement agreements in and of themselves, I would simply say, that what you should do is as soon as possible is start to work with an estate planning attorney, who's going to sort of pick up the pieces after everything has been hashed out in the settlement agreements. And then you're going to have a new set of things to think about, I guess is what I would say. Instead of just doing your estate planning with your goal of, everything is going to go to the spouse and the kids, well, maybe now you've got a goal of, if my spouse remarries, what would I want to have happen in those circumstances? Or, how can I make sure everything goes down to my children without my ex-spouse having any control? Right? You've got a different set of objectives that in some ways involves taking someone who you had given a lot of power to, and now you're taking that power away and making sure it doesn't kind of seep into any future decisions either. So, when you're married, you've got one set of goals as a family unit in many ways, and then that all ends when you're getting a divorce. And so you have to do planning that sort of takes into account all of the new things that you have to consider, which are kind of the opposite of what you had to consider before.
yeah, I mean, maybe you do and maybe you don't have different goals with regard to the estate plan. And I think it's a good idea to consult an estate planning attorney before you sign the settlement agreement. And in New York, 97% of people who are getting divorced sign a settlement agreement before a judge makes a decision after a trial. So chances are they're going to sign that agreement. And if estate planning is a major thought process, or if there are significant assets to be thinking about, I think consulting an estate planning attorney before you sign the agreement, the way it is a good idea to consult a financial planner before you sign the agreement, making sure that you really understand the full ramifications of everything that is being contemplated in that document itself. I think that a lot of people feel really at sea, following the divorce and out of control. And in your experience, how can estate planning help people start to feel, well, or regain that sense of control and at least stability?
Yeah, the interesting thing about estate planning is that it's a very empowering thing. I think that the general public, we know it's something we're supposed to do, and it's kind of a check this off our to-do list thing. But what my clients find is when you go through the process, you learn so much about, not only what you own, but how it's titled. You really have to dig in and think about, where do I want these accounts to go? Who's important to me? Who do I want to nominate in all the different capacities? And that process in and of itself, I think, is very empowering, especially when you're making new decisions, decisions that are very different from what you might have decided 5 years ago when you were married. So I think it helps people after what must be a very stressful, emotionally draining, financially draining process. Once it's done and it's settled, well, now is the time to kind of rebuild your life. And that maybe that looks a little bit different for everybody, but part of that can be taking control of, well, this is now what I own. This is what I want my future to look like. And my estate plan is going to reflect that. And I'm going to take some control over that. I decide what happens next to my assets, to my care, to my legacy. That can bring a lot of peace of mind.
I think a lot of people find it really daunting and scary because now I've been through, and even if they haven't been through, but imagine someone's been through or is going through a divorce, it seems like a real crisis in their life. And it certainly is a massive transition, especially if you've been married for a long time. And now you want me to contemplate death? What do you say to those people, Laura Cowan?
Yeah, well, we flip it around. We flip it around. You are contemplating death in a way that allows you to really get some clarity and some stability on what's going on with your life, right? This is what estate planning is about. Who matters to you? What would you want to have happen? And also, what would you want to have happen in the event of an incapacity? Who's going to pay your bills, manage your finances, make healthcare decisions for you if you're incapacitated? It is overwhelming. It is a little bit scary. It is regardless, even if you haven't gone through a divorce, estate planning can be overwhelming. But I would ask, people who are going through this to think of it maybe instead as, this is a way to help me get control over what's going on with my life. And if you find the right attorney, they're going to guide you through that process.
For somebody who's listening, who's thinking, I know I should do it, it's kind of like eating my vegetables. What's kind of like the first thing along those lines of sense of gaining control rather than losing control that someone could start thinking about to help them actually get to doing it?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we offer at our firm in New York City, and all of the lawyers in the 2 Hour Lifestyle lawyer community, which there's over 500 of us now across the nation, one of the things that we do is we offer a complimentary peace of mind planning session, is what we call it. And that's just simply a 1 hour consultation, whether it's in person or via Zoom, to learn your options, basically, because we know that you're coming in, maybe you've got a little bit of information from the internet, a little bit from your neighbor. It's information overload these days. To sit down for 1 hour in front of a qualified estate planning attorney who's familiar with, the issues that you will have been dealing with post-divorce, and just getting some clarity on, which documents do you need? Do you need a will? Do you need a trust? I don't like to think of it as what do you need, but rather, what problems are you trying to solve? Maybe one instrument is better than the other for that. Just get some clarity on what choices you have going forward. And then most lawyers do a nice flat fee, these days. But I think that initial consultation, just getting some questions answered, is a really good start.
Yeah, I think this is a good time to remind people that you're listening to the Divorce Dialogues podcast, and I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues has been educating people about divorce and relationship issues for over 10 years. Subscribe to the podcast and don't forget to check out our previous episodes on the podcast website, divorcedialogues.com. And I'm talking today with Laura Cowan about estate planning and the intersection with divorce. So, Laura, if people want to learn more about you or your community, how can they do that?
So they can go to my law firm website. That's one place to learn if you're interested in getting an estate plan done. I work with families in New York. That's lauraecowanlaw.com. And you can also reach out if you need support from a different state with an attorney in a different state. I would say just message me at Laura at 2hourlifestylelawyer.com, which is kind of a mouthful, but it's the number two and then Our Lifestyle Lawyer. And I can certainly refer you to an attorney in whatever state you need help with.
That's great. And Laura's contact information will be in the show notes. So, one thing that I think often, and I say often on this podcast, is that, and from my perspective, divorce sits at the intersection between what was and what will be. And that really allows people, if they so choose, to reevaluate their professional path and their personal path going forward. So, what lessons from your own reinvention might inspire our listeners who are at that intersection about their lives and their future?
I think your career is allowed to have different paths, right? And different chapters. And a lot of our sections of our lives are just built on chapters. And I think that your personal life is allowed to have chapters as well. And, you're not really starting from scratch. You're building on what you have learned. And it's the time, it's a scary time, but I also think it's a time where you can reevaluate, who I am, what matters to me. Maybe that means changing your profession, maybe not, but you're allowed to have these chapters in your life and in your business. And maybe just think of it that way.
I think it's not just that you're allowed to. I think we all do have chapters in our lives, whether or not we acknowledge it or not. One of the things that Margaret Mead said when she was married and divorced three times during her life, and at the end of her life, someone said, "How do you feel about having three failed marriages?" And she said, "I don't think I had any failed marriages. I had three marriages that ran their course and ended." And I think that really makes a lot of sense in terms of what you think about your personal life and the relationships and what the trajectory is. And in terms of my own professional life, I think of it as in roughly decade long set, right? Because it's a decade that I'm like, I get super interested in something. I learn all about it. I get really good at it. And now I'm like, well, now what, right? What's the next decade going to be about? And so I really think that for my own professional trajectory in terms of my interest in and pursuit of excellence and mastery of, that it makes sense to, and I think of those sort of like chapters too. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So just thinking about people who are divorcing later in life, maybe they've had a few chapters open and close already, whether or not that's marriages, careers, jobs, places they've lived. I mean, there's so many ways in which one could define these chapters. How should people who are divorcing later in life think about their adult children, retirement accounts? What are some, as you get closer to perhaps activating your estate plan, what are some what advice do you have for those people?
Activating your estate plan. That's a good way of putting it, is you're getting closer to when we know this is going to come into effect. Yeah, so then you're dealing with just different concerns that you would have as a younger person. So, we find that people tend to fall into three buckets. You've got people who are really concerned about nominating guardians for their minor children and who's going to take care of the children and who's going to have custody and all of that. And those are the concerns. Well, when your children are in their 40s and 50s, then, that's not as much of a concern as it was before. And then you've got business owners who've got their own set of concerns. But, then again, you're looking at your beneficiary designations yet again, Social Security strategies. Maybe you're thinking about leaving your retirement assets in a smart way, just depending on the value of your estate. Maybe you're looking into doing planning that is going to protect your Medicaid eligibility. There's just a whole bunch of different issues that we start to think about as we get older that aren't really on the table when we're younger. And then I would also say, as you start to get older, now's the time that you can start to obviously nominate your children in various capacities. You're not going to name your 3-year-old as your healthcare proxy, but you might name your 35-year-old as your healthcare proxy. So as the children get older, maybe they start to really have more of a part in your estate plan. And maybe this is something that you can talk to them as adults before the fact, right? So everyone knows what's happening. There's no surprises. They know who to turn to. I find that a lot of families just feel like this is not something to be mentioned, and then someone passes away and, now it's kind of chaos. It's okay to talk to your adult children about what you have planned so everyone's on the same page.
I just have to say that my father recently passed away, and his estate plan is so neat and easy And so it leaves my mother, my sister, and myself, and it like with like very little to do. And it's like it is such a relief that this isn't just a horrible show of chaos. And so I just want to endorse what you just said and say, like, from my personal experience, wow, what a huge relief it is not to be dealing with all of that.
That's a great story. It's great to hear that because, my own mother passed away without an estate plan and it was the opposite, right? So I think you start to hear
Yeah.
about how it can be really good or really bad and which one you want.
Right. And of course, it's the lawyer in the family that falls to me. So I'm like, well, there's hardly anything for me to do. Amazing. So that's really a relief. So for people who are feeling financially or emotionally paralyzed after divorce, what is one actionable estate planning step that you think that they can take to move forward with this?
Yeah, the actionable step is revisit your beneficiary designations. That will be the very first thing that I would do because those override, your will, they override everything. So double check your life insurance, your retirement accounts. And then as soon as you're able, emotionally and financially, consider meeting with an estate planning attorney because, there's a lot of different things to think about. It's not just the beneficiary designations, there's other things to consider. And so I think, really just meeting with an attorney and understanding your options and what you need to be considering. But you're right, it is kind of an intersection of, the estate plan, your taxes, your CPA might have something to say about it, your financial advisor, your divorce lawyer. All of these are moving pieces that intersect in a way. So it can be overwhelming. Start with the beneficiary designations and then start to look for a good estate lawyer who's willing to work with your other professionals.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I mean, divorce is really an integrative process. If you think about it, it should be that because it impacts so many aspects of your life, one of which is your estate plan and your financial plan, your parenting plan, right? The plan for your intimate partnership. There's so many things involved. And if the professionals you're looking with are only working with are only willing to look at their tiny little piece, then that leaves you to figure out how it all connects. And that's not always the easiest thing to do when you're going through an emotional experience such as divorce. So, Laura Cowan, in the last few minutes of our show, let's turn our attention to attorney. And I know you've taught hundreds of attorneys to rethink their careers. So, what advice do you have for divorce attorneys who feel overwhelmed or stuck in what they're doing? Because this is a tough job sometimes.
It is. It must be a very tough job. I've never actually done family law, but I can only imagine, how emotionally draining it can be. I would give the same advice that I give to my estate planning lawyers, and the advice in the book really applies not only to the lawyers, but any profession. I think that there's a way to revisit how we think about being an attorney. I think that COVID has really given us permission to revisit how we think what being a good lawyer looks like and what our law practice can look like. I think even 5 years ago, it's hard to believe it's been 5 years, but you went to the office every single day. We had Zoom, yeah, we had it, but it didn't change the fact that we went to the office every single day. That's just what was expected. We all know that changed overnight. And, so whatever family law attorneys are now able to do, virtually, we have no more control over our schedule. But I think just in general, it's okay to say I don't necessarily want to work 40 hours a week, especially with estate planning. This is something you can do part-time. It's something that you can do 20 hours a week. Maybe you serve 4 or 5 clients a month. What I'm really getting at here is you can work that way and still be considered a good attorney. You don't have to be in big law. You don't have to be running yourself into the ground. And I think these are things that we've been telling lawyers since the beginning of time, but I feel like we have more permission now post 2020 to just really acknowledge it's not just the people who got a job in big law who were the good lawyers, right? You can be a good lawyer and still only serve 2 or 3 clients a month and be doing it part-time and be doing most of it virtually. So maybe just giving lawyers permission to rethink. I also think rethinking kind of the dollar amounts. A lot of family law attorneys, I would imagine, are solos similar to estate planning. And there's just all of these numbers that we see out there. Build your $500,000 firm, your $1 million firm. There's a lot of, I think, kind of messaging coming at us that's really geared towards making as much as possible. And that's what you have to do to be successful. A lot of the lawyers in our course, when they come in, they've never sold a $5,000 estate plan because they've been working for someone else their whole lives. And when they come in and they get that first client and they sell that first estate plan, it's really, really life-changing. So my overarching advice is to read the book and to see if you can get some ideas about how to think about being an attorney that doesn't make you miserable.
Yeah, and just in our last minute or two, I'm thinking like this idea of a good lawyer, a good attorney, right? Like that's a perspective of us as attorneys who am I a good lawyer? Are my colleagues a good lawyer? But it's also something that clients want. They want a good lawyer. And what it mean, right? What that means might not be the same from both sides of that line. You know what I'm saying? Like I would think that we're talking about like so billing a ton of hours and getting to the pinnacle of our profession working in a big firm or whatever, that's like an internal thing. But I think from a client perspective, someone who's working 20 hours a week and has more time to really think about and the needs of each client, particularly in the estate planning place or the family place, like that might actually be a way better attorney for that particular client. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think it can be a selling point in many ways. Listen, we're not discouraging anyone from building their $1 million firm, their $10 million firm. That's fine. But I also think, I've got a wait list for my law firm. And I think one of the reasons I do is because I make it clear I only serve 4 clients a month because this is one of many businesses that I have. And I'm basically teaching in the course what I'm doing in my own New York City practice, which is about 4 clients a month. And that's basically enough. That can be enough. You don't have to feel like, that's not enough.
Laura Cowan, thank you so much for being my guest on Divorce Dialogues. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.